Welcome to 78.4, the podcast that helps you leave a godly legacy for future generations by showing you incredible things God has done in the lives of men and women around the world. If he can do those things in these people's lives, imagine what he can do in yours. I'm Bob.
And I'm Matt. And today, we're going to talk about step one in getting it done.
Okay.
Well, we all have passions, right, Bob?
Yeah.
We have burdens that we feel God put us here on this earth to do, desires to see a vision God gave us accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we take that first step? What part does God play in it, and what part do you play in it? And this being our season 2 finale, we've kind of come full circle to show you the God you're in business with here. We started out the season reminding you that God is unstoppable. No force is stronger. Then we reminded you that what your part is, that's staying in the battle, no matter what, and that you can actually communicate with God. He hears your prayers. We talked about the stumbling blocks that can get in your way when things don't go quite the way we think they should. Roadblocks like having the wrong perspective in life, pride, disobedience, division, and unforgiveness. And now we're almost back where we started. God has a plan for you. You know it. You feel it. You have a passion to do something great in his name. And he has a plan for you that's greater than we can even imagine. So now what? We know the end. We know the troubles on the way in the journey. But what's step one? Just give me step one, right? Well, today we take step one. And make sure you stay till the end of today because we have some cool things ahead we want you to hear about. But first, taking that step off the edge.
How would you have liked to have been the first guy to try a parachute?
You mean like the first parachute ever made?
The very first parachute ever made.
Right. Okay.
So your buddy says, no, I promise, this will work. You just put this pack on your back,
Right.
and when you get up to, say 1,000 feet or so, you open up the door and you jump out of the plane. It'll be fun.
Sure.
You know?
It sounds crazy.
Exactly. Well, what about the first guy to try a shark cage? Your buddy goes, hey, I want you to dress like a great white's favorite meal and get in the water with him. Sometimes ideas are so ridiculous that you're like, thanks, but no thanks. But if the right person is asking, somebody who knows what they're doing, saying yes can lead to incredible experiences. What if the idea is from God? What if he's calling you to something wildly out of your comfort zone? Or something way beyond your abilities? That's what our first speaker, Don Mansfield, experienced.
When God has something for you to do, relax. Take a deep breath. He's got your back. In the 90s, we had a big push within our organization to expose the world to the claims of Christ, to the gospel. And of course, in Albania, since 1965 and the Cultural Revolution in China, which Albania mirrored, atheism was the official and enforced religion, and so you couldn't practice anything. Every Muslim mosque, every church was closed down, every minaret was turned into a factory smokestack. And so I kept saying, Lord, what do you want us to do? What do you want us to do in Albania? And finally, during a country directors conference, I was sitting there, and as he started the talk, I literally saw something from the Lord. Call it a vision, call it a dream. I was wide awake. I am not very much of a Pentecostal charismatic type of guy. I mean, I believe God can do these types of things. But I said, guys, I think the Lord has given us this vision. And as I shared with them the scope of it, which was the entire country, using the Jesus film, and I literally saw the whole thing. Now, at the time, we only had a team of 8. And it was ridiculous to even think that that was possible. But the Lord had so convinced me through this that I started sharing with all the other leaders saying, tell me where I'm wrong in this. I mean, the team was like rolling their eyes like, you've got to be kidding. There's only 8 of us. I mean, how is this going to happen? And it was a good question. It was a valid question. 67% of all population lived in rural areas in Albania at the time in 1993. 53% of all the 2,400 villages didn't even have a road into it. They had trails. There's parts of this country that are like the Alps in Switzerland. if we have these base camps out in these village areas, I mean, we don't even know how many rolls of toilet paper to have on hand. I mean, how do you figure this out? And I remember we did a budget for it, and I thought, there's no way. I mean, it's going to take at least $250,000 just to get set up. And so we knew it would be really a difficult thing to do. And as we refined it, it went down into a 10-page plan. But the interesting thing, at the same time, we heard that the leadership of the Southern Baptists, who was David and Mary Carpenter at the time, were emphatic. They wanted to meet with us. And I said to Alex and Corey, who were the team leaders, I said, why don't you come along with me? I said, I don't know what they want. So as we sat there, we ordered dinner, and literally, for the next 20 minutes, they just launched into this vision that God had given them. And as Corey and Alex were listening to them, they were just like, and finally Corey goes, and they said, Mary Carpenter says, well, we're not trying to tell you what to do. We're just telling you what God gave us this vision for. And Corey looked at me and says, Don, just show him the 10-page plan. And so I handed him this. He says, and I said, you're now entering the spiritual twilight zone. And so they looked at this, and it's a plan to reach all Albania. And they go like this. You mean to tell me we've been trying to pour out our hearts for the last 20 minutes and you already have it written up? It was word for word. Literally, word for word. We wept. And Corey and Alex, who were rolling their eyes amongst the other ones, going, it's God, it's God, this is God. And what God showed me became what is called the Arrow Project, Albanian Evangelical Rural Outreach, AERO. And so we were walking by, and my wife Catherine goes, Don, he says, Hella Mission is in the orphanage right here. They said, we have this helicopter. It's a Bell Jet Ranger. And I said, well, we need to see if it even fits. And so they showed us the helicopter, and we took the equipment from the Jesus film. We set it in. The long pole thing went in the back of the tail, closed the thing, and we still had the generator. He went over to the back door, and in between the two, he just went, and it was like a millimeter of space. And he says, it's like this. He was a Swiss guy. He says, it's like this helicopter was made for this equipment. And they said, we're in. And so literally it started. And I remember the night that I laid awake and I thought about the money issues, and I heard this thought, this is mine. You don't have to raise a dime. I got it. And it was just like God said that to me. I said, okay, God, if it's yours, it's got to be yours, because I can't do it. I have no power for this. I have no ability to this. I'm not a great administrator. I'm not a great fundraiser. Literally, some guy calls, he says, we have this bus to give you. What do you think? Sure, bring it on. And then the Southern Baptist says, they want to come and help you set up base camps. They can do all the showers. They can do all the bathing. We can do all the trench toilets you need. And I go, where in the world is this coming from? I didn't even know we needed this stuff. And God just started laying it on. And I didn't have to raise a dime. Literally, I did not raise a dime. And God just brought in $250,000 in 330 days. It was the largest summer projects that Crusade has ever had. We had over 5,000 people involved from 31 agencies, 18 different countries. Every village, every town, everyone had an opportunity. We're here to tell you about Jesus. And God did it all. He just did it all. And it was like, will you just trust me? If I call you to do a plan and it's my plan, you don't think I'm going to take care of it? And I'm going, I cannot believe what God is doing. That in the most difficult countries, in the most difficult geography, God can give you a plan that makes it possible. He can lead you, He can guide you, He can equip you, He can empower you. God has ways to do things. And if we just listen to Him, if we just pray and say, Lord, how do you want to do it? Because if you just take any generic plan, you stop listening to God because you think you have the plan. And sometimes, most times, all times, His plan is better than ours.
God can lead you, He can equip you, and He can empower you. Most of us will never be called to anything as huge as what Don was. But that's what I love about this story. The same God who called and equipped Don and his team to reach an unreachable nation is the same God who is calling you and will equip you to reach your family, your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, or whoever he's calling you to reach. That's because the people you see every day are just as important to God as an entire nation.
Right.
And he wants you to know the power and joy that comes from serving him.
Right. And as far as that step one I mentioned, Don knew it was crazy talk, this vision that he got.
Oh, yeah.
Which
Absolutely.
I was thinking about, that might actually be a big hint that this idea is not you, but someone bigger than you. But even though he knew it was not so, he didn't keep it to himself. Step one is telling someone, anyone, everyone, because the next thing that happens is God verifies it like he did with Don by the fact that things then start to happen. Things you couldn't do yourself. They fall into place. Or you find that others have the same vision. You speak out what God put on your heart, and you'll find that God has already spoken to others on your behalf ahead of you, and things begin to roll. That verification by God and others coming along to help with what you're doing is a key to knowing, I think, you're on the right track.
Absolutely, I agree.
Which brings us to Bob Tiede. You last heard from him speaking about his house burning down and him shifting perspective to know that what can't burn is what really matters. And when you have that transformation of perspective, your eyes are suddenly open to see God verify his plan in action.
In November of 1991, Josh was introduced to the doctor who was the head of 6 Russian children's hospitals. And this doctor shared the desperate situation they were in. They went to the pharmacy. There was next to no medicine. He shared that children were dying, that they'd ceased to do many surgeries because they had no medicine. They went to the kitchen, to the pantry area. It was empty. There was no food in the pantry. We have no food here to feed children. And he pleaded with Josh, will you help us? Well, Josh shared with him that we're just a little evangelism ministry in the U.S. We don't do humanitarian aid. We're not against humanitarian aid, but we've never done this. And while Josh was in Moscow, he made calls and got hold of 2 very significant humanitarian aid ministries in the U.S. You'd recognize their names. And when they heard the need, they said, oh, Josh, we wish we could help, but we also are overcommitted. We probably couldn't touch that for 12 months. And he called me about 10 at night and said, Bob, I just got back. I've got to share with you what God showed me in Russia. So we get together, and he said, Bob, I just sense we have to do something. If we don't, there's no one else. And I share that because the next 7 weeks were to this day, the most miraculous weeks that I've ever experienced in ministry. God raised up $2.5 million. God raised up 160 volunteers. Even that's just a little story here. Josh and I and our team were praying for 40 volunteers, and God provided 160. And when we got to Russia, we understood why. We would have never gotten all of the aid assembled and distributed with 40 people. And I imagine when God heard our prayers for 40, he said, Josh and Bob and that staff team, they mean well, they just have no clue what they really need. And so I'm going to send them what they really need instead of what they're asking for. Because he's a wonderful Heavenly Father. He's the great provider. And he knew what we really needed. And the miraculous doesn't end quite there. The group that prepared this load was told, I think you can put on 104 pallets. But we're going to weigh every pellet. And when we hit max weight, we're done. And when we hit max weight, we're not going to take stuff off to put stuff on that's of higher priority. All 104 pallets got on. And the load master came to my colleague, Dwayne Zook, and said, who prepared this load? And Dwayne said, well, a bunch of volunteers in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And he said, but Dwayne said, well, what's wrong? He said, oh, there's nothing wrong, but my question is, how did you get it so close to max weight? You're within 200 pounds of max weight. We never get it that close. And again, we hadn't weighed anything. And throughout that was, again, just this lesson. If we'll take the initiative in faith to take that first step, God will part the Red Sea. He'll provide a 747 if there's no other way. He'll raise up money to fund this and humanitarian aid, and he'll give you even more than you asked for. We were able to provide clothing, gifts, teddy bears for over 6,000 children. In fact, we had enough for not only the hospitalized children, but their siblings. We had enough so that if nurses asked for their children or grandchildren, we had things to give them. But the fact is, God's Holy Spirit desires to use us. And if we'll be available, the Spirit of God will do amazing things that we can't even dream of. You know, it says man plans his way, but God orders our footsteps. There's nothing wrong with us planning, but isn't it exciting to know that God's ordered our footsteps? And many times through his Holy Spirit, we're at the right place at the right time, and we could have never organized it ourselves, but God did.
Man plans his way, but God orders our footsteps. I love that. And to me, it kind of sounds like a dance. Like it's not just God flinging a lifeless body around, doing flips and twirls with your limbs flailing about.
Well, that's quite an image.
And it's definitely not just you. Because without the moves God does in this dance, the footwork he coordinates with others, and his unstoppable power, there is no dance. There'd just be one wild dude on the floor gyrating in circles aimlessly. It's a dance God made for you. And then you find out it's actually one of those flash mobs that he set up with countless others you didn't have any idea were prepared to do the same thing. And yet, something far bigger than anything you could have done dancing alone. And like a flash mob, it's really cool to watch the elaborate intricacies that God put together to create this perfect moment that you get to be part of.
I like that illustration. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So Don talked about the beginnings of Project Arrow and the Spring Break project that went along with it.
Right.
Well, our final guests, David and Linda Pendleton, took part in that Spring Break project, but they served in a slightly different capacity than the other volunteers because David is a ventriloquist, and he uses that talent in his ministry. And before you ask, Matt, I've already planned on putting this video in our show notes.
Right. I was going to ask that. It's really cool seeing a ventriloquist actually do visually what he does.
So in 1994, Linda and I had the opportunity to go to Albania. And this was one of those spring break trips where you go and you spend a week in Albania and do outreaches, mostly on campus in the city of Tirana. And so Linda and I both went, and I brought along, of course, my ventriloquist puppets, and whenever there was opportunity, I would pull those out and just kind of show people what I did and entertain people, but also to bring the message of the gospel in a lot of settings where people in other cultures see this ventriloquism and they're really amazed, especially if you're in a culture where they've never seen it before. Albania was really one of the most closed countries to outsiders in the world at that time, and it had just opened up to outsiders coming in from other countries to interact with Albanian people. And so one of the guys that we met was a fellow by the name of
Genti.
Mm-hmm. And Genti saw what I did and got this idea, you should be on Albanian television.
Which we thought was hilarious. Oh, just be on TV.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the show that is coming up this week called The Spectac, and see if they can put you on the show.
A show that we would describe as a combination of Miss America, Star Search, all these elements of dancing talent and male bodybuilders and lots of variety. Of course they'll put you on.
Of course they will. And so we laughed about this and we thought, okay, this is a show that's coming up this week. It's a live show that's going to be covered. It's going to cover the whole country.
So we were in this show.
So we were in the show and I did my little piece.
David Pendleton.
I was planning the finale, and the finale would be that I would get the host of the show.
It was a little bit like in the United States, like a Johnny Carson. Everyone knew this gentleman.
He was a big celebrity in Albania, and I thought, wouldn't it be fun if I got him up there and I push in the back of his neck and I'll have him open his mouth? Well, at the last minute, he said to me, oh, I forgot. I have a wardrobe change that I need to do, and so you can't use me, so I'm out. Well, then I turned to Avni. He was a student at that time, and last minute, I've got no other options. I'm going to bring you up and push on the back of your neck and use you as the dummy.
This is all we've got at the last minute, so we're going to go with this.
Best I've got. So he came up and he did a fantastic job. You know, I pushed in the back of his neck and
Say hi.
Hi. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream.
And it seemed like the entire country saw this show. And since I had gotten Avni up there, that was totally a fluke. I was not planning on that at all. But here's how the Lord had a different plan. And at that time, there was a strategy to take the Jesus film into some of the remote areas of Albania.
Taking helicopters into smaller areas.
Yeah, so that's what they called it, was Project Arrow.
And there was a village where they had no contacts. They didn't know anyone. How are we going to get word out that we have this film we would love to show?
So one of the stories is that Avni was a part of one of these Project Arrow trips. And they showed up in this village, and the leader of the village is shaking hands with the team that have now come to show this film. And he looks up and he sees Avni. And he looks at him and he says,
You were on TV.
you were on television. I saw you on television. You were the guy that was with that American. And of course, he's saying this all in Albanian.
So why are you here? And Avni said, I came because I would love to show a movie to your whole town. And the leadership said, our whole town will be there.
Yeah. Yeah, we trust you. You're famous, and we want everybody to see whatever it is that you have to show. We are going to make sure that everybody in town is going to come see this thing. And so
We just thought that was such a sweet gift because we were so disappointed. David did not get to use the person he thought he was going to use, but Avni's face got to be on TV, and it made a difference for a whole community.
Yeah. So there was an example of how something that I was just so disappointed that, I was really hoping I could get to use this other guy. But just what a great thing that it was that it came back full circle, that it was God's plan all along, that it was Avni's face that needed to be on television, because it was God's plan that this whole community of people, we wanted to come out to see the Jesus film. And so that was just another example of how God takes a situation that I was disappointed about and yet turns it around into what was actually his plan all along.
Yes, you just trust the Lord. It was a sweet, special experience.
Yeah.
So God calls and equips. He provides abundantly for his plans, and everything goes wrong. I loved when David said, God takes a situation that I was disappointed about and then turns it around into what was his plan all along.
Right. That's a big part of the fun for me. I mean, I'm there. I tell people what God laid on my heart to do. Others come along. But then however it ends, it's often nothing like I imagined and way cooler, because he even uses the things I thought for sure I screwed up. It actually, Bob, reminds me of another Josh McDowell outreach.
Oh, yeah?
Where I'm sure you remember the story, but for the listeners, where there were these students who were promoting an event and they totally screwed up. They wore Halloween masks.
Oh, yeah.
Ran around scaring people to promote this like late October seminar that he was about to put on in a week. And because people were so horrified and thought a Satanist was coming into town, Josh got way more publicity than he ever would have normally. He got to explain who he really was and talk about God's love on the local news, and it had a big impact on the campus. And that, to me, is really encouraging because it means just being on whatever wave God sets up for us to ride. He even takes into consideration our stupidity. and I can have plenty of stupidity.
I've had more than my fair share.
Yeah. And I can know that despite me, like, because God actually knew me going in anyway, that he's got my back, whatever happens once this snowball of God's gets rolling downhill.
What's great in these stories is the idea that God has it all worked out, and he gives us the privilege of taking part in what he's doing. You know, look at how Don and Bob and David and Linda were blessed by obeying God. The joy, their faith was increased. One of the coolest things you can ever do is introduce someone to Jesus. And each one of them got to do that on a huge scale. And I can testify firsthand about the Operation Careless because I was on that trip with Bob and I saw how God worked. It was amazing. If you look at these stories, there's a kind of thread that flows through them. In the first story, we see God giving Don the plan and bringing all the necessary components to make it work.
Right.
Then with Bob, we see almost the same thing where people obey God even though none of them had a lick of experience in what God was calling them to do. And God took it and he ran with it. Bob said it so well when he said, if we take the initiative in faith to take the first step, God will part the Red Sea. And then David and Linda were obedient. They did their best. They trusted God, and it didn't go the way they wanted, at least in their understanding of the situation. That's because God had his plans all along, and their quote-unquote failure was what God used to make his plan work. To me, there's three keys here: obedience, action, and faith. Obedience to God's call, action. It wasn't just enough to go, hey, God, that's a great idea. Each one of them had to get off their butts and get going. And faith. They each had to trust God, take him at his word, and trust that he was able to do things no matter how messy the situation got.
And it gets messy. Life is messy. We live in
Absolutely.
an imperfect world, and we are part of that imperfection. Heck, we're living it right now. All of us trying to stay afloat during an insane year last year that appears to be turning into the Lamb Chop song that never ends. It goes
please,
on and
no.
on, my friends. It's crazy. It doesn't seem to be ending. We're still dealing with this well into 2021. And the same messiness of life, the unknowns that God didn't let us in on when we started, even spills into our little podcast here. Like why our season finale is after just 7 episodes this time.
Yeah. When we started this podcast, we promised we'd do 10 episodes a season. Unfortunately, I can't keep that promise right now. A few episodes ago, I told you that I have cancer. Well, since we recorded that episode, I learned the cancer has become more aggressive than previously diagnosed. So, in a couple of days, I'm going to have surgery, and I'll be out of commission for a while. Hopefully, I'll be back on my feet in a few months, and we'll be producing season 3 before you know it. But it's all in God's hands. Obviously, this isn't how I thought things would go when we started the season. Yeah. It certainly isn't how I would have planned it, but come to think of it, 2020 didn't go the way I planned it either. Yeah. But this is where I get to practice what I preach. God is faithful. I'm confident he called us to do this podcast, and he's going to do something great with the hurdles in my way. After all, look at what he did through David and Linda. If he can open up a remote village because David's routine on TV hit a snag, imagine what he can do through my cancer and our podcast.
That's right. And I know you didn't ask for this, but we love you, Bob. And I know you're going to have people all over the world praying for you while we're away.
Thanks.
Now, that said, Even though we will be away, we're not leaving you lovely listeners high and dry. No, sir, Bob. Right, Bob?
Oh, thank you.
I'm happy to announce that while we're away, for the first 7 weeks, we're going to play a series from Crew's founder, Bill Bright, called Returning to Your First Love. This was a guy who not only ran one of the largest missionary organizations in the world, he had a radio program back in the day. He was an author who wrote over 250 books on Christian living. Bill Bright was one of the most respected Christian leaders of his time. But whenever anyone would ask him how they could pray for him, he would always say, "Pray that I never lose my first love." So here's just a sample of one of the episodes you'll get to hear starting next week.
God's word, James 1, admonishes us to rejoice when we have trials. And Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 18, "In all things, give thanks. This Vanette and I have done since the doctor told me I was dying and there was no cure." As a result of this demonstration of faith, the 2 years since that doctor's report have been two of the most wonderful, productive years of my life. God has honored our faith, and the promise of Jesus is a daily reality when he said, "He that hath my commandments and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me, and he that loveth me shall be loved of my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him." If there's someone listening to my comments today and thinking that they cannot return to their Lord, I want to assure you, you can go home again. And let me tell you why. Jesus commanded us to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. I do not believe there is any issue more crucial for you and me to consider in this life. As the Apostle Paul has shown in Romans, there is no distance of time or space that can keep you from God's wonderful love.
But wait, that's not all. After that, each week we'll present the audio from one of our legacy stories until we return with this show. Trust me, the coolest part of my job, and Matt, I think you'd probably agree, is we get to sit at the feet of these people and hear their stories.
Yes.
And see what he's done in their lives. And you're going to get a chance to do that too. So that just about wraps us up. Our hope is that in hearing these stories, it'll help you grow in your journey with the Lord. After all, the easiest way to get to your destination is to follow someone who's already been down the same road. Don't forget we have links and articles to resources in our show notes as another way of helping you grow in Him. So please, check them out.
And the Dave Pendleton video. That you're gonna
And the
play.
Dave Pendleton video.
You get to see him actually doing some ventriloquism. It's cool.
And you get to see some of the spectac, which that was a treat in and of itself.
Yeah.
All right, so please check them out. Also, please email us. We'd love to get to know you.
The audio you heard today comes from some of the more than 400 and growing videos on our website, legacy.cru.org. That's legacy.cru.org. We also have a YouTube channel, Crew Legacy, and a Facebook page. Please check us out. And if you like today's podcast, we ask that you please subscribe so you can get the next one and the next one and the next season to come. Also, please rate us. It helps others hear about our podcast.
78.4 is a podcast of Legacy, a project of Crew.
Thanks for listening. God willing, of course, we'll be back later this year to continue this dance with all of you in season 3. And as always, while we're away, we want to encourage you to remember that whatever God did in the lives of the people you heard speak today, He can and will do in yours. So until we're together again, go out there and continue to live the legacy.